What a vacuum of horrors. They told him the plane had crashed an hour ago, a mile from the airport. It had skidded into the surrounding woods with 50 passengers and 6 crew members on board, all presumed dead. As chief investigator for the National Aviation Safety Board, Sergio Martelli was on call for any emergencies. When rescue services rang at 1:30 in the morning, he was still awake, drinking in bed and staring at the cracks in the plaster of his ceiling. Was it comin' or going? The voice on the other end of Sergio's work phone was shouting over the background noise. It was attempting to land. Overshot the runway. Which airline? He coughed, trying to hide his slurred speech. Cantos Flight 437. He knew some of the Cantos pilots. Who was flying? Reading, the voice said. The co-pilot's last name was Clark, first name Magnus. The captain, last name Martinez. Sergio was jolted out of his stupor. Is it Sandy Martinez? It says here it was Santiago. He told them he was on his way to the airport and rang off. He laid back down, trying to fathom the idea that Sandy Martinez was dead. Sergio took a cold shower to sober up. He quickly shaved, nicking himself on the same spot on his neck as the day before, and staunched the blood with a corner of tissue paper. Fixing his tie, he noticed a drop of blood blotched the white collar of his uniform. Outside, it was a cloudless night with a vivid crescent moon. A perfect night for a landing. Driving into the airport, he navigated through chaotic scenes of crowds and cars. Pitiable wails of the families of the deceased mixed with angry vehicles vying for limited spaces. The vans of several of the local news outlets had already arrived, and representatives from Cantos Airlines would give a statement soon, Sergio guessed. Then he noticed the national stations were also covering the story. At the gate, security asked him for his identification. From the lanyard around his neck, he presented his NASB badge. As they waved him in, Sergio asked the guards why there was so much attention, motioning to the hordes of reporters and camera crews. A guard leaned out of the kiosk, smiling, his excitement obvious. Didn't you hear Emerald Wasselser was on the plane? The dumb bitch wanted to be at the border rally. I don't know anything about it, he replied and drove in. Sergio of course knew who Walser was. After a conventional career start as a journalist and then failed run at politics, she finally found her calling as an alt-media personality and polemicist, consequently becoming hated and loved in equal measure. Maybe Sergio hadn't liked Walser either, but the guard's glee over her death angered him. It was never a good idea to wish death on anyone. The NASB team had converged onto the airport's control tower, setting up a makeshift command room on the top floor. It gave a bird's-eye view of the scale of the disaster below, with floodlights from rescue services illuminating the wreckage and work crews. The room was well used, with coffee cups, fold-out chairs and paper tossed over 3 portable desks. 2 large white boards stood at the front, one containing the most recent badge photos of the dead pilots. Sergio entered without acknowledging his 4-man team. His teams were always men, since the women of the NASB refused to work for him. He walked up to the photographs. The first officer's appearance was nondescript, a bland, handsome man in uniform. Martinez's photo he scrutinized longer, trying to remember the last time he'd seen him. A year ago, maybe. While Martinez wasn't smiling in the picture, there was a vacant idiot's grin in the eyes. Did he always look like that, he wondered. Most of the team had their attention fixed to the room's TV. The station was covering the crash, highlighting unflattering photos of Emerald Walser next to overhead images of the wreckage and a scrolling chirun beneath, reading, Airline Disaster. Troubled media figure. Dead at 49. A team member named Todd carefully approached Sergio. Chief, we got a call a half hour ago from the boyfriend of one of the passengers. Apparently, she sent him a text. Sergio interrupted him. Did you get my colas? It was well known that Sergio required a single case containing exactly 12 cans of a particular brand of Diet Cola waiting for him at the start of every investigation. Some thought it was ego, some willful eccentricity. Others just snickered that the brand was Diet. Todd made an awkward gesture toward one of the tables. They had brought the correct brand, but with delicious contempt, Sergio saw that they were not Diet or the right number. I always require 12 colas. Todd shrugged, sorry. They only sold them in packs of 10, Chief. Accompanied by the click and fizz of a newly opened can, he stared at Todd and mumbled, right. He poured the cola into a porcelain cup. He didn't like the taste of tin and didn't so much pour as squeezed out the contents. After taking a gulp and throwing the crushed container into the cardboard recycling bin, he asked, "Where are we at?" The weather had been ruled out as a factor almost immediately, Todd said. Visibility was good. No rain. Little wind to worry about. Sort of conditions most experienced pilots would have no problem flying in. There was no lightning. No gusts or gales. Sergio stared at him. Yeah, I figured that out on the drive here. In a voice louder than was needed for the small room, Sergio addressed the entire team. Alright, so no force majeure. That leaves us with 3 possibilities. Mechanical failure. Hijacking. Or pilot error. The cleanup crews were scouring the crash site for signs of mechanical failure, sifting through the debris and piecing together the remains. The plane had scraped a half-mile path across the forest floor, leaving a fiery trail of destruction. But the ground investigators noticed the surrounding treetops were still intact. Reading from a clipboard of notes, a team member named Troy said, "Our guys on the ground said it looked like the treetops hadn't been scorched." Sergio held out one pudgy forefinger. Okay. The plane was probably not on fire before the crash. Troy flipped up another page from his clipboard. They also said the engines had bits of trees sucked up inside them. Sergio extended a second finger. Okay. Both engines were probably still working when the plane crashed. No in-flight fire and no engine failure. As for the possibility of a hijacking, Sergio dismissed it as unlikely. The cockpit doors were intrusion and bullet-proofed, opened with codes only the pilots knew. That left the scenario that it was pilot error. It was the primary cause of most airline disasters and the one Sergio didn't want to be true. The stats on the first pilot and captain were red. Both pilots were experienced. Combined, they had more than 3,000 hours behind the controls. Sergio knew Martinez was a good pilot with a good record, but even experience could result in overconfidence or worse still, boredom in the cockpit. With most jobs you had to get everything right 100% of the time. It was expected. But one serious mistake and you could end up fired. And if you were a pilot, you could end up dead. If it was pilot error, the black boxes would tell them. Within the hour, ground crews radioed Sergio with the news that the boxes were no good. In the middle of a hot, dry summer the woods were like tinder and the priority for the fire crews had been to keep the blaze from spreading. When the flight and cockpit recorders were eventually found in the rear of the burning fuselage, they were so damaged, the data was unrecoverable. God damn it. Sergio kicked one of the tables. They should have put out the back of the plane first. Breathing heavily and wondering what he was going to do next without the boxes, he accidentally looked up at the room's TV. The national channel covering the crash had begun showing the press conference already in progress. 3 representatives from Cantos Airlines stood behind a podium, with a single, large microphone. Usually, Sergio took no interest in the press statements. The reps typically would issue practiced condolences to the families of the victims and finish with a few non-comments about the possible cause of the crash. But what caught his interest this time was the body language and expression on the face of the lead rep. She looked lost and the veneer of professionalism was cracking. Turn it up. I want to hear this. When the sound of the TV was at a discernible level, the lead rep was replying to a reporter's question.
We don't comment on rumors. It's frankly dangerous and incautious to start speculating about any causes for the crash just yet.
Sergio stood still, his mouth involuntarily dropping open. A feeling of unease grew among the team, each suspecting what was coming next. The reporter continued her line of questioning. So you won't confirm or deny any truth to the rumor the captain may have been inebriated while flying? Trying to change the subject, another of the reps stepped in. Like we said, it's too early to speculate about a cause just yet. But so far we've ruled out the weather. Undeterred, the reporter told the reps she had received a screenshot from an anonymous source. It was of a text sent from one of the passengers to her boyfriend just before takeoff. The text was read aloud. I think the captain might be drunk. Sergio snarled, what the hell is this? Each team member was studying a different spot on the floor. Trying to restrain himself, he asked. How does the media know about this and we don't? Troy cautiously replied, the boyfriend did call the airport. He said he thought it might be important. We don't know how the press got hold of the text. So, we knew about this and no one thought to tell me. The team looked at one another and thought better than to say they had tried to tell him. Sergio started pacing the room like a cat in a cage, working through the situation in his mind. The pre-takeoff announcement would have been the captain's voice on the PA. The first officer had been on instruments and tower contact. Martinez was at the controls. Martinez had a strong accent. Maybe the girlfriend thought they all sounded like that. He asked his team, how do we know this isn't fake? We confirmed the girlfriend was on the plane. The manifest listed her as Seat 3C, Zone 2. Name Maria Sanchez. Sanchez. Sergio was glad he hadn't said out loud what he was thinking. His work phone buzzed. The call display said head office. It was a call he knew was coming. Hey Serge. We've got some of Emerald Walser's people here. They want to know if Cantos Airlines diversity hire killed their client for her views on immigration or because he was drunk. What do you want me to do with this? We lost the boxes. Make putting this rumor to rest a priority, Serge. Use the tower recordings. Understood. He rang off and squeezed another cola into his cup. Men, some might say we are between a rock and a hard place right now. But the Germans have a pithy saying that goes, between shit and piss we are born. That's where we are now. Stuck in the middle of the crazy shit libs who wished Emerald Walser dead and the loony pissheads on the right who think she was murdered. We need to hear what Maria Sanchez heard. He swallowed a gulp from his cup and walked over to Martinez's photo. Martinez was never a big drinker. After all, it took one to know one, and Sergio knew. And he never held any strong political beliefs. But what was behind those idiot grinning eyes? The digital tapes from the departure tower, containing the voice recordings between the controller and the cockpit just before takeoff, were sent to Sergio and his team, Priority 1. With a gut punch of dread, Sergio stared at the recordings on the table. Finally, after a long sigh, he said, let's hear it. The recording started with the plane's slow departure from the gate. Through the compression and static and ambient noise of the cockpit, Sergio and his team heard the first officer's voice. Ground, this is Cantos 437, just a heads up on the push. The tower replied, Cantos 437, advise ready to taxi. The first officer began his pre-flight checklist. Hydraulics good. Thrust reverses are armed. Second engine started. Ignition is off. Altimeters are 3000 across the board. Moments passed. The plane was now stopped at the hold short line, awaiting the tower's permission to leave. While the cockpit recording was quiet, Troy said, voice analysis of the first officer is showing an elevated tension above normal. Sergio held up his hand, signaling Troy to stop talking. The captain's takeoff announcement would be soon, and he didn't need a machine to tell him the first officer sounded nervous. Did he sense there was something wrong with his captain, he wondered. A voice could be heard, announcing over the plane's PA system. "This is your captain speaking. Welcome to Flight 347. I mean 437. I hope everyone is good this evening. Or this morning. I guess it's still evening. It'll be morning when we land. We'll be on our way soon, so sit back and relax and enjoy your flight on Cantos Airlines 347. Sergio could not believe what he was hearing. My God, he does sound drunk. But the strangest thing, he realized, was not that Martinez sounded drunk. It was, that the voice didn't sound like Martinez at all. It had no trace of an accent, and Sergio wouldn't discover the significance of this until later. In airline culture, the captain was king of the cockpit. If the first officer respected this unwritten rule, he would never ask his captain if he had a few drinks on their stopover. So, Sergio was surprised when the first officer ignored the rule about no non-essential talk or activities in the cockpit during the critical phases of the flight and asked his captain bluntly, "What's so funny?" As Martinez engaged the throttle, and pushed the plane past the point of no return, he replied in a voice that unnerved the whole room of listeners.
"You'll see."
Sergio was reeling, like the ground was giving way. This just went from bad to worse. He looked at his team. They avoided all eye contact with him. What the hell did Martinez mean by "you'll see"? Sergio had interviewed the on-duty controller, the last person to speak to Martinez alive. She told him it sounded like the trouble began as soon as the autopilot was disengaged. After that, the plane's speed increased and began to veer off. She lost radio contact and didn't know what happened until someone on the ground said there was a fire in the woods. Then she knew it must have crashed. She told him, "I noticed the captain took a long time between his responses. I thought he may have been tired. Or drunk," Sergio now thought. He found it strange she only talked to Martinez. He was piloting the landing and was not on communications. Where was the first officer? When Martinez's body was recovered, there would be a toxicology report. For now, it was time to confirm what was becoming more and more obvious. Sergio told his team, "Let's hear the tower's recording of the landing." The tapes of the ill-fated landing were keyed up and pressed to begin. The tower could be heard first. Cantos 437. Ident or acknowledge. There was a long pause. Sergio leaned in, to listen more closely. The sound of erratic breathing could be heard over the tapes. The controller tried again to get a response. Repeat. Cantos 437. Acknowledge. Then, that strange voice from the departure recording was heard again. "This is the captain of Cantos 437 on final approach. Copy that. Descend at your discretion. Maintain 2600. There was another pause and more erratic breathing. Sergio now thought he could hear words being spoken, sotto voce. The voice eventually replied. "Roger. Your lights are in sight. Cantos. You're too far right of the localizer. Can you change your heading?" Sergio broke in. "Does anybody else hear that?" In the background of the recording he heard a muffled thumping. One of the team said, "I hear it." The noise sounded to their ears too sporadic to be mechanical. Then with a sickening pang, Sergio realized what it was. Someone's at the door trying to get in. He's locked the cabin crew out. And that breathing. Sergio was certain he could hear the pattern of words. He told them to isolate it and bring the volume up. What he heard now he finally recognized as the true voice of Martinez, and he was repeating, as a terrified mantra, the words. "No lo dejes entrar." Sergio spoke Italian and knew enough Spanish to understand what he was saying. "Don't let it in." At that point in the recording the onboard computer began to sound its alarm with repeated warnings of banking, banking, banking. Then finally, terrain, terrain. Pull up. The transmission ended. Everyone was quiet. Then Sergio said what the whole room was thinking. Martinez intentionally crashed that plane. This was now a mass murder investigation. It was no longer a pilot too drunk to fly. It was a pilot having a full-on psychotic episode. A personality split and a total paranoia of the crew and passengers. And Sergio was also starting to suspect the involvement of something much stronger than alcohol. Troy. I want you to go to Martinez's last known residence, look for drugs, illegal, prescribed, whatever. Trevor. Check out when his last psych evaluation was and what it said. Ted. Look to see what kind of protocols Cantos Airlines have in place to ensure no one can put anything into their pilot's food or drink. Todd. I'm gonna need you to get me some more colas, buddy. They left him alone, staring out of the tower's window at the smoke and ash rising from the crash site. The psych evaluation would be a dead end. There was no incentive for a pilot to jeopardize their career by answering the questions honestly, to admit they were having mental issues. Maybe he was drugged. All the bigger airlines had ironclad safeguards to prevent their pilots from being poisoned or drugged. But a smaller, regional airline like Cantos? Maybe something did slip through. His work phone buzzed and he answered. One of the investigators at the site told him the recovery crew had found and identified the bodies of everyone on the plane. Everyone, except for one person. What do you mean Martinez's body is missing? You found the first officer's body. Look right next to him. In a shaky voice the investigator told him. You should come down here and see for yourself what we found. Sergio needed the body. Whatever was in Martinez's system was still in there. The whole investigation could come down to what the toxicology report found. And if Martinez had been spiked, the perpetrator was out there and probably finding this all tremendously funny. The crash site smelled of burnt jet fuel and water-logged wood. He walked into the cordoned-off area around the remains of the cockpit, not bothering to show his badge to security. The head of the recovery crew approached him. I don't know what to tell you, Serge. He looked pale. I've seen a lot of bad crashes but I've never seen one do that to a body. He pointed to what was left of the first officer. Sergio knew it wasn't because of the crash. It was clear Martinez had brutally killed his first officer. The cabin crew, no doubt drawn by the noise of the first officer's violent death, tried to enter the cockpit and were locked out. Then, fully in control, Martinez deliberately crashed the plane, killing every passenger on board. Sergio looked around. His body has to be here somewhere, he said. We looked everywhere. Sergio motioned to the woods. The crew leader shook his head. There's no way anyone walked away from this crash. One of the security guards shouted. He didn't walk away but he definitely limped. His flashlight shone on a blood trail. His prints looked like he's favoring one leg. Sergio recognized the man as the guard from the airport kiosk. Sergio grabbed a flashlight and a radio. Serge, you can't expect to find him in these woods tonight. Why don't you wait? It'll be light in a few hours. He didn't reply and took the kiosk guard and another with him. If Martinez had limped away somewhere to die, he could not be very far. And if he wasn't dead, he was Sergio's living, breathing black box. As they headed into the woods, he asked the guards what they carried for weapons. Each was armed with a gun and one taser. The kiosk guard laughed. You think this guy is still dangerous? Sergio had seen people exhibit incredible acts of strength combined with high thresholds of pain while on drugs like PCP. Anyone capable of inflicting that much damage on the co-pilot while surviving that crash needed to be approached with extreme caution. They soon lost the blood trail. Sergio figured most of the blood had been the first officer's anyway. Each of them decided to split up to cover more ground. After about a half-hour's walk, the scent of the trees overpowered the stench of the extinguished jet fuel and the floodlights from the crash site were fading and it was getting harder to see. Sergio increased the intensity of his flashlight. The further he walked the more he felt Martinez was still alive and he swore to himself that after today he was going to lose weight and stop drinking altogether. In the quiet of the forest, he was startled by the rude squawk of his radio. I think I found him, the kiosk guard whispered into his walkie-talkie. Something is definitely moving out there. Too big to be an animal. Sergio answered. Don't go near him until I get there. The guard laughed. For getting rid of that waltzer bitch, I'm gonna shake that bastard's hand. Sergio regretted bringing him. Where are you? There was no answer. Then Sergio heard a scream. Then another. He started to run, altering his direction to where and when the screams grew louder. He ran until he stopped at the sight of a figure crouched over the bloodied and dying guard. As if sensing Sergio's presence, the figure straightened and stared at him. It was Martinez. He was missing half his face. Sergio didn't know what he was seeing. It was feral yet unearthly at the same time. Sandy. You're having a psychotic reaction to something. He felt like he was trying to reason with an animal. Slowly he circled Martinez. I think someone might have put something into whatever you ate or drank before takeoff. I know this isn't you. You need to help us find out who did this to you. The side of his face that remained showed recognition.
Hello, Sergio.
It was that strange voice again, the one from the recordings. With an unnatural movement, Martinez crept toward Sergio. From behind Martinez, Sergio saw that the other guard had also been drawn by the sound of the screams. He was pulling out what Sergio thought was a taser from his side holster. Too late, he realized it was the gun. He shouted. Don't. I want him alive. But 2 quick shots later and Martinez was lying dead at his feet. The kiosk guard's crumpled body gave up its involuntary spasms and showed no more signs of life. I wonder if he tried to shake Martinez's hand, thought Sergio. The corpse was transferred to the closest hospital morgue to join the rest of the recovered bodies. It was a small building, never meant to accommodate this many dead at one time. With only 30 fridges, the room was already filled to capacity. What the hospital did with the rest, Sergio didn't know. He was still waiting for the toxicology report and had agreed to officially identify Martinez's body for the hospital's records. Sitting across from the recently deceased captain of the doomed Flight 437, he stared as if in a dream at the grotesque hole in the side of his face. The room was cold, making him even more tired than he already was. The photographer was finishing up, taking the last pictures of Martinez for their records. It was obvious she wanted to finish quickly and get out of this room. There was something in Martinez's face that could not be looked at directly. It wasn't the disfigurement. A person could get used to that. Even in death, there was something in the eyes. A rigor mortis of pure hatred. She hurriedly collected her equipment and left without a word. Alone, he felt himself gnawed off. Then was startled awake by the loud entrance of the hospital's pathologist. Sergio looked at his watch. It was later than he remembered. The pathologist said, "They told me you were down here. We finished running the toxicology tests. They came back negative." He could tell Sergio wasn't happy with the news. "I still wanna see the report. We can send your office a copy." Realizing the man was implacable, he told him, "We found nothing, Mr. Martelli. No drugs. No alcohol. Not even caffeine. Your man was clean." The pathologist shrugged and left to get a copy of the official report. Alone again, a sharp, needling rage overcame Sergio. Aloud, he said to Martinez's corpse. "You goddamn lunatic. What happened to you?" He rose to stretch, then felt the room's temperature drop. He could see his own breath. From his peripheral vision, he thought he saw the tongue of Martinez's corpse flicker to life. A voice whispered,
"Come closer and I'll tell you."
Sergio's heart started and he turned to face the body. There was now a stench in the room, the corpse was giving off a fetid odor. Again, the tongue flicked like a snake shedding the last of its dead skin. A glob of black bile oozed out of the hole of the mouth. He drew closer to the corpse. "Is this Sandy?"
No.
Sergio thought that he must be so tired he was hallucinating a conversation with a dead man. But didn't he need an answer for his report? Didn't he want to know what happened? Who is this?
Don't you know?
Sergio knew it was the voice from the cockpit recordings and the one that had addressed him in the woods. He asked it. Where is Captain Santiago Martinez?
In hell.
Sergio said, stupidly. Why?
He let us in.
The voice faded, then was gone. Mr. Martelli. A voice of flesh and blood now spoke to Sergio. At the door stood an officer and his deputy. We're here for the identification. Each wore a puzzled look. Sergio turned to them, trembling with terror. You want an identification? All right. He pointed to the body. That thing is not Sandy Martinez. He pushed past them and hurried out of the room. He was done with everything subterranean and dark. He craved daylight and sought the nearest exit. Sergio had always believed everything was made up of atoms in the void, buffeted by randomness and chance. But tonight, the void had spoken to every atom in his body, and if nature abhorred a vacuum, then the vacuum would destroy any living thing in this universe if it could. It was an all-consuming emptiness and, in the woods, it had recognized him. As he raced down the hallway, he almost ran over the pathologist. Disconcerted, the doctor called after him as he went by. I have the forensics report you wanted. Sergio never looked back. The final report submitted on the crash of Cantos Airlines Flight 437 concluded the tragedy was a probable suicide, caused by a pilot whose unhinged mental state had gone undetected. It was deemed a failure of the system, and, in a follow-up report, 12 recommendations were added to identify and prevent such an incident from ever reoccurring. The official findings and recommendations were unanimously accepted among all involved. Unanimous, except for one submission. Chief Investigator Martelli's. After what must have been a very dark night of the soul, he scrawled over his report the words. This flight was hijacked. One of his colleagues later remarked, the man has obviously gone completely pazzo. Despite the newly implemented safeguards, another crash occurred only 4 short months later. Again, it was ruled a probable suicide.